JOSIAH MILLER, Away West, read by the author Larry Hatch. Chapter 2, The Way Thickens. I awoke with an aching head to the shrill blasts of a military trumpet, soon joined by snare drums which seemed to split my cranium more with each stroke. Hungover and hungry, I scanned the floor on which I still lay and determined it seemed like the stockade of a modern fort. Given the folding form of the bed, the metal plate, the perfectly squared stones, and the shape of the windows. That explained the trumpet, too. Before I was fed any breakfast, and much before I could regain my speech to any intelligible degree, I was whisked into the office of the captain and asked to explain myself. Normally, I would have gone on trial like my compatriots. I was still known as a skillful scout to the U.S. Army, and so was given the courtesy of a pre-tribunal explanation. We'd been caught trapping on Tuscarora land, and on account of this, the Braves tried to burn down the fort at the cost of 5 infantry lives so far. When violations of Indian treaties are found, justice could be swift and final. Harsher for the red man, and still harsh enough and brutal to those of much paler skin, as we are. This is all to say that a military officer was free to dismiss violations by white men, especially of his own ranks, and often did. When it was clever or expedited to useful causes, the laws might be enforced with passion. When white lives are lost, especially those in blue uniform, the vengeance is apt to be a couple of notches more severe. I was not liking my odds, and already could feel the hollow, aching pain of an empty belly for months to come, and the violent heaves from spoiled water. I've been there before. I was given a very harsh admonition by Captain Birch, and my skull seemed to split with every harsh syllable that rang out. My mind was beginning to clear, but only a little. Sir, the last I can recall, I was admonishing some fellows for trapping on the wrong stretch. Out of bounds, I said. My knack for lying on the spot being brought to full force. I was usually convincing, for never did I pause, as a liar would when inventing a story. I blurted out my thoughts and worked from there, giving a sense of false veracity because of the speed and ease of language. Likely story, you had furs in hand, the fully decked out man complained and proclaimed, the very glint of his gold insignia hurting my brain. Those came up from the river in fair land and belonging to us. I merely hoped to warn the others, I continued, seeming as if still drunk from my awkward swaying and unsteadiness of foot. I was just thinking about their young scalps, sir. Any decent trapper would. It's the decent thing to do. I used decent twice, for good measure. I deferred a bit and lowered my head, never looking at him in the eye too long. One had to also be humble in these circumstances. With such a man, you had to make eye contact to seem honest, but never too long to seem like you're challenging him. That was true of a wolf and a bear. Luckily, the judge is standing over there in the corner. If he wishes to accept our answer, well, things will go well, but if not, he barked out. I saw the judge advocate before long and the band of other fellows who I don't still remember meeting. The whole lot of us were drunk the night before and trapped and drank and trapped and shot and other things. As none of the lads were in any shape or degree of memory recalled to refute my story, the judge believed me enough to let me go. He was perhaps just happy enough to own the goods of 5 or 6 men and add them to the fort's slim larder. My pelts were returned, and I helped myself to some of theirs for good measure. Lied there, too. I made haste to the hills after this unexpected ordeal and marveled at my luck. What I had been doing was helping the lads trap in Tuscarora land, showing them the best ways of avoiding detection. Well, detection from the red man, not the blue man, as it turned out. All this in return for 1 in 5 pelts. Now, outsmarting any set of braves is not an easy thing, but Trapper Lee had taught me much about putting traps only on routes the creatures use, and those too narrow for the tribes. Tribes and animals often share trails, and buffalo trails or rabbit trails are one famous example. Beaver use narrow, very wet routes to rivers that are unfit for humans, not steady afoot, mushy, wet, boggy, and one can easily put traps there under thick brush and mud and be undetected. It was harder to trap this way, and many degrees safer, however. Secondly, you could check your traps in the dead of night, and not a bright and hopefully not on a bright moon if possible, to avoid detection. I also learned them about taking the shine off a metal trap with boot black, so it's not as easily spied, and never baiting them. For the Tuscarora are apt to smell the bait as the victim. They're apt to see the glint of the track before them. We would use boot black or mud to hide the traps, and not an aromatic boot black as they do in all white territory. We'd use the local mud, nothing too pungent. Other young trappers camouflage their traps with plucked sprigs of herb and shrub that add scent to the air that any brave will notice. Foolish. We only use dead dry shoots with little scent and a bit of mud. Anything disturbed and making a scent or making a color, something out of place, will be noticed, especially by the Tuscarora. For I had learned by this time in my life that it paid to do things outside the law very well. It often paid better to teach and manage others in the same way. It was generally less messy and apt to spare your scalp, soul, and life's blood when one acted to consult and teach bad ways. I was becoming known in those parts for many skills of this nature and a good willingness to assist with difficult crimes and ways of tricking the government, the red man, pretty much any human being with things to be tricked out of. I had become a foul trickster, schemer, and scammer of the type government treaties, and privately not so proud of this decline. I had become what I deplored, but somehow the comfort and glint of gold bullion drove those pains of guilt from my skull. I joined in some measure the Denslow gang, ruled by the iron fist of James Denslow. If he had a way of doing criminal business, it was the use of overwhelming force, and in the use of local talent with specific knowledge. We did some jobs that robbed many men, white, brown, yellow, and red, of all good, valuable things, and putting the proceeds only in banks we pledged not to rob. He had a list. Don't rob a Denslow bank. Bar the doors. One night about 3 a.m, I heard crashing down in my metal cans and glass jars in the back room of the cabin. It was not one but two ravenous grizzlies trying to pull down the walls and get to the things they smelled. For all the stone I'd employed, it would be some time before they might fully succeed. It was mortared, but wild mortar, mud mostly, not too well. It was the crudest of mud mortars, so the rocks didn't hold too well, as they did with city mortar, made with cement and lime and rock and all that sort of thing. This pair of bears were natural stonemasons in reverse, and were adept at dismantling the structure more than any human might expect. Their desire, paired with muscles as thick as a man's head, was a potent and fearsome effect. But my shelves were very loose, and everything fell to the wooden floor. I built a sort of turret in my roof of the main room, and climbed up there, firing at the furry invaders with all my barrels, 3 guns. They beat a quick retreat, but I knew they'd soon be back. To defend myself, I put my honey store down the trail a piece where they were not likely to be diverted. I sat down and waited for them. The bear charged as are apt to do. None of our options are good when an angry bear is in pursuit, and in these situations Trapper Lee had taught me to use the pursuing species' faults and weaknesses to full advantage, this including humans, by far the most awkward and weak of hostile species. Now, a grizzly is heavy and sometimes cumbersome in the close woodland, even if very, very fast. I spotted a rock outcropping leading to a series of high steps and at least one cave. The outcropping was full of loose shale which crumbled and tumbled with clicks and clacks under my feet as I went 20 feet high and higher still. Under the bear's weight, it was a true avalanche of rock, and he scarcely climbed 5 feet without pawing wildly in frustration. I kept up my pace, praying not to fall downward in his grasp. I reached the first cave, and try as I might, he could not get there. And try as he might, he couldn't get there. I hid in the cave until night and crawled down. It was dark, and I somehow knew the scent of the bear was still there, waiting for me, hiding, waiting, wanting as they do. I went back to the wilderness courtesy of my new bearskin coat. I guess I left something out. The bear had retreated, and I shot him in the back. In those parts, that's legal for critters, not other men, and most certainly not cowboys. Heading north, I walked 2 days in the parching heat and quite magically found a fine paint horse that already came with a saddlebag, albeit an empty one. I did not notice until later the poor animal had bloodstains on its tail. Its former owner surely had met a bad fate. It was not uncommon to find horses wandering about the wilderness in these parts. The Indians got most of them, but not all. I joined up with Bill Tatum, who was well known as Billy in those parts. It just turned 30 now and dropped the Y for the appearance of maturity. Bill Tatum now. He and Jasper, whose surname I never knew at all, were a team of a dozen years going, and I knew all the tricks I knew, and then some. The three of us pulled in more than 1,000 pelts that spring, summer, into the coldest fall. We let Jasper fix the poor pelts to get a higher price. We had a way of daily oiling the small fur and stretching it over a month to increase its size. Regular oiling helped. He also had the same dyes as the Navajo used to make rugs black, brown, and orange. That helped a little. They would not come off in your hands and might make a sketchy, dull pelt quite uniform and lovely. At least take out the bad spots. We took in over $600 and split it 3 ways, vowing to work together again sometime. I proceeded west and then west some more, and finally weeks had passed. I felt like I must be near California when in fact I was days from the Golden State. The mountains became larger and more insurmountable. Nothing like my type of merely 2,000 feet, full of nice caves and lush fir, pine, spruce, aspen cover. I was out in the open both day and night, and not with my customary amount of cover and protection, and that made me nervous. I found a low cave, not 3,000 feet up, that next day, and camped there for some days, spreading out my rations to see what remained. My rations were lean and my whiskey low, so I entered Carson City, by now a very legendary town, with mixed hopes and diverse expectations. The town had been a very wild place, with killings by the hour for some of its history, and now was quite genteel, civilized at other times. The biggest industry was entertainment and no longer coffin making. I had no idea where on this spectrum they would fall this very day. In fact, today it spanned the entire spectrum of fancy ladies in silky Paris dresses, men riding painted carriages with gold crests, to filthy vomit-soaked, urine-scented drunks rudely getting in their way, firing shots with a whoop and a holler for no apparent reason, and collapsing in front of people with class and charm. Nowhere else had I seen the dregs of humanity mix so freely and openly with the truly wealthy and exalted examples of our species. Indeed, some men had transformed from one to the other rank and then back again. I was too proud to be considered a simple mountain hick, so flashed my expensive silver pistols and gold buttons at every occasion. I might look simple and crude, but I had the touches that the right man would notice. It was amazing how the ladies of commerce turned to notice me then. Like all cities, it was only about who you were this very day and how much money you could spare to buy pleasure and purchase friends this very day. Not yesterday, not tomorrow. I left Carson City with enough supplies for a month of decent living, always, of course, to be supplemented with some fresh local meat, birds, and fish as they happened to cross my path. In those years, you rarely had to seek them out, for the woods and streams offered them up in glorious bounty, thick and healthy, juicy, succulent, flavorful. My first plan was to rob anybody who came by. My good nature got the best of me. I noticed a glint on the hill across the wide trail. There was another fellow waiting in the same nefarious manner as myself. I had a spyglass, as they called them then, a monocular I stole off an army fellow years ago. I could see the next wagon coming. The lady in the bonnet had a 6 o'clock shadow, so it was clearly a setup by someone. What a clever one, this bearded lady, armed for bear and getting even with scoundrels. My rival across the way came down as I smirked and was about to laugh at his fate. He fired on the family, and the wagon canvas parted, revealing a machine-driven gun which turned him into stew meat in about 3 seconds flat. They spat on him and rode on. Such was the vengeance of the army against scoundrels and road scum in those days. The next wagon came along and stopped with a young lad from across the path, and his blood was now drying in the hot sun in a wide patch of darkest red. "What happened here?" the driver shouted to his passengers. I replied, "The same that happens to you if I don't see some money in gold pronto like," with an uncharacteristic sinister growl. I had my repeater armed towards their heads. "Hurry, or I'll take your boots and make you walk," came something evil from deep within me. They complied, and I counted a full 404 with 4 fine pocket watches from this haul. 2 were solid gold. I had no use for jewelry from women, unless clearly of gold. Doubtless they had hid more, but I never dally for an extra $100. It's that last bit of greed that gets the best of the crooks. "Take what comes to you readily, and don't dally for the extra bit," said Jason Prill in a form of wisdom approaching Trapper Lee. Josiah Miller, Away West. Read by the author Larry Hatch. More fools and lowlifes. Interspersed as if by randomness and not a choice, I was kind and helpful to the next passing wagon train. I'd rob too and feel remorse of a kind, though never the sharp prick that preachers ramble about. My conscience, if it existed, was as thick as the leather of a good book and as invulnerable as a church bell. Perhaps it was the nature of my reception, but I could not rightly decide how to deal with one of these convoys until I rode up to them. The smile of a young lady or a ready rifle of the wagon master tended to raise or lower my favor, but I had no clear rules on approach. This lot from Kansas and some of them earlier from the Ohio way suited my mood that day. Besides, I'd been beastly to the last two wagon trains. These folks welcomed me to ride along. As they had not been able to afford a real scout, I became over the next few weeks the man who guided them, hollow by hollow and meadow by meadow. I knew this area well, and where good water was, most importantly where wild braves would be looking out. They had already had the sense to stay off the wider main wagon trail, as there were many eyes from red to pale men along that path. They had more sense than fervor, and I usually liked that kind of person. One morning, three men dressed in a bandito style, like Comancheros, but more Mexican, rode up on us before breakfast was finished. Two of our men grabbed rifles and joined me in the confrontation. The intruders got off their horses instead of firing, as I suppose they would do to establish quick dominance and terror. But putting the fear of death deep, deep in a foe is vital from the very first second, or so Trapper Lee had told me when it came to thieveries of all types. These men seemed to want food and water, and we obliged, keeping our eyes on them, while they eagerly drank and scraped the rough slurry of taters, rancid meat, and a kind of white sauce from their pans. The white sauce needed more pepper each day, for it did not get better with time. One fellow stood and made an announcement in poor English that he'd intended to take things from us, like it be so or not, and yet as a gentleman they would have some of our journey, as the ladies were with us. The offer was not on the plate as far as I was concerned. I rose up from the breakfast circle and said in perfect English, loud and clear for all to hear, "That will not be, my friends. We move on with all we have now." "This is not in doubt, hombre. We will do as we said," said one toothless man who seemed in charge. He laughed and spat towards his fellows, one of whom was very young and very nervous. "I said first, senor, that I tell, and if necessary I make," I said like a heroic mountain man I had occasionally been in my head. I did not think myself a hero mostly, for this man only welled up in me now and again, and I am not sure if he was my friend. He was in my head anyway. I then walked up to the fire and put in an iron. "I have here a red poker, aching for your liver, my friend, hombre." I said hombre as people do with scorn for Mexicans, though in general I liked them. The man tried to laugh, but I saw fear in their eyes, and as my fellow men pointed now 5 rifles their way, I turned my back and seemed to reconsider my hostile gesture, but in one rapid movement I charged the lead man and swept his legs from under him before his comrades could do a thing. I put him down, and without a breath I plunged the glowing end of the iron into his belly and held it there, twisting, grimacing, and showing righteous indignation of a sort, looking up briefly, glaring at his horrified co-conspirators. It was righteous indignation, and yet also the opposite form all at once. Such a crafty paradox it had become. The entire wagon group gasped, and even one of the men holding a rifle fainted like a sack of rotten potatoes. We had a lot of them anyhow. One of the young lads had the sense to fill up one of the banditos with lead, and soon a second man nailed the last one. The rest were gone by now. Our battle was over, and while the folks in general were now frightened to approach me, a few of the men thanked me, and one tipped me a gold coin that came from Germany or someplace foreign with things on it like that. I departed and rode off content in my doings for once. I had severed, dried, and nailed the 3 genitals of the banditos to the front of the wagons for good luck upon them all. I don't know if they tolerated them long, but that's what I did. The Wyoming way. It was now snowing up in Wyoming, as it seemed to do every month of the year save July. An old trapping buddy of mine, Wolf Castile, had bought a trading post up near Casper and was needing a fur man to serve as a broker and to find other supplies of a special nature. With my reputation in more than 8 territories for being fair to other trappers and hunters, I sent business his way and persuaded new lads to give us their best furs before anyone else. We paid top dollar in cash up front. We were always fair and never stole in those days. I ran smack into 2 young trappers who were doing things all wrong. Besides being so crude, obvious, and noisy, they endangered us all by inviting native attention. They were stringing the traps in the wrong direction so beaver might step on a harmless bit of metal and get scared off. The beast's first knowledge of a trap needs to be a sharp snap. Nothing else. They're also picking dry spots, which are convenient for humans, but not the sort of beaver that will normally run. Their massive fire had surely not escaped the native gaze. We were all in danger. That didn't do. I greeted them kindly, and from the cut of my fancy multi-fur coat, they could see I'd obtained some status in the wild world. Well, at least in terms of coats. Howdy, fellers. I was looking for buying some furs for the Bessemer trading post. We ain't selling, mister. We sell direct like for more and are no fools. The slender one spoke, wearing overalls like a green boy from a farm with a plaid flannel shirt. The way you set out traps, you're doing a fine impression of fools. Let me show you here, I said honestly, but already with much offense. I apparently came off as arrogant and condescending when I intended to be just helpful and really hand them more money for their work. Mister, we ain't asked for your button in or nothing, said the half-bald one. I was not in terribly good sorts that day, and on account of my diet, mainly of rancid beans and whiskey that week, the digestive penalty had not put me in the best of spirits. I also figured his response was quite wrong for a man of my stature and age. I pulled out old silver and drilled him in the ankle, and by the time his buddy felt for his iron, I put one in his knee. I ran their horses off with a blast of bullets for good measure. Think before you speak rude, fellas. Someone else would have done you worse. As I galloped off. That someone else was usually me. New Mex insanity. In my traveling about, I went to a piece of New Mexico new to me and found a particularly odd community there known as Maris Ridge. It was a collection of different people from all walks of life who didn't seem to fit in anywhere else. What they had in common was a universal tolerance of anything different or anyone different for themselves, and not a desire to control them or herd them into a particular church or saloon or trade. There was law, but the sheriff thrived mostly on suggestions for prudent living, having a velvet form of the 10 Commandments. But more than 2/3 of his approach was mere common sense. He was likely to argue you into a state of obedience than drill you down. They each lived as they pleased within wide limits and savored, I think, how others were clearly different. There was no official or mandatory thinking of a particular stripe or way of doing business. You just had to be good and fair in general. If you did not fit into the big regular town, Maris Run would suit you well. I had a good run of pelts on the first 2 mules and had 2 fine coats that were promptly sold there in the town. There was one family who felt it wrong to wear something from a killed creature for mere vanity on account of the warm climate there. They stated their argument politely and without fervor or dogma, leaving it for others to think about and maybe think differently someday. I rather liked this way. Finest pelts, sewn together hard. Will last for years as a tidy bed. I shutted my wares out in the center of town. They tolerated that too. You didn't have to be a store owner to sell your wares. 2 store owners had much tolerance for vendors in clear competition, but did nothing about it. There seemed to be a godliness, gospel, and kindness in this town that all those church-run towns don't have. How ironic. The town got stranger by the hour, and I was offered 3 young brides by my 4th day in town. I seemed stable and hardworking enough, and fellers came out with their daughters in tow. How odd. Should they not be better off with a fine young ambitious fellow in this tolerant town than a stranger with mountain ways? It seems the town had come mainly from a part of Europe where a daughter might be sold off, in effect, for a dowry and family do better in years ahead. The Indians of some territories are alike in this way in valuing female children for their trade value. In this way, some Europeans and natives are quite alike. Now, a young son was priceless for a farm or shop and would not be given away for any amount of money. There was no male servitude there. They seemed offended I would not consider the offers of these brides, and so I eventually relented and picked the prettiest of 3 blondes on offer. Her hair was long, curiously so, all down her back, long. But her clothes were plain, her waist thin, and her eyes as green as the forest of fur. She had a dainty way in all her movements, and with a sort of elegance that firms up a fellow in ways that, well, only a fancy girl can. I could by their eyes and prolonged looking that some of the fellows in town had been taken to her. Having parted with half my furs, 1 silver pistol, and some gold nuggets, they asked us to write a letter when ye settle, and they seemed to care little if she was seen by them again. They rode off to find a suitable wild home. I had a wife already in Lucia, and perhaps yet not so much. I didn't care either way that day. Gracie Ann. It was mere hours before I had consummated things with my new bride in a tent and a tidy bed of fur, taken all her purity with as much tenderness as my pent-up lust could manage. There was no talk of a proper church wedding, and perhaps they assumed we would head towards that. Then again, I didn't see a church there, I don't think. I reviewed my memory in full. Never saw a steeple. Grace Ann did not take to domestic ways in the wild right away, and she'd been used to cooking on an iron stove and had little understanding of outdoor cooking pots over a roaring fire. That's a set of cooking skills, quite different. She was poor at skinning critters, and I think had dismembered nothing larger than a chicken in her past. Her mother had packed her with some domestic things like thread, needle, bows, and lace, and she retreated to those the day after our intimate introduction. I thought I might have broken her, for their fur was stained with a bit of blood, though not in that regular female way. Perhaps I'd hurt her, and it was 4 days before we coupled so again. This time my tenderness and concern were improved, and a smile came to her face for a time. I was taken with her beauty, soft cream flesh that provided endless hours of enjoyment, as it would for any man. Her long hair was so gold and covered me fully in our pleasures. Now that I had a wife, it seems only right to make some effort to build a cabin. I dragged some suitable spruce down the hill to a perfect location overlooking a crystal blue lake that was fed by an active stream. By the time I had taken the horse with logs down the wrong trail, I spotted a ready-made cabin in the wood. I decided instead to add to it, for the nights were getting cool and I didn't feel ambitious enough to build a cabin in 2 weeks. The original cabin was old but made sturdy, and after her cleaning, the fir floor seemed pleasant enough. There was no view of the lake, but it was no more than 50 paces from where I had hoped to build before. Now that I considered it, the original plan would be more visible to tribes navigating the lake and too much bait, so this ended up being the best choice, adding on to the old thing and cleaning it up. I soon had a maze of obstacles established around the cabin, including sharp stakes, metal bits, and small bits of barbed wire that I salvaged from the old place. My fish smoking and curing areas came along soon, and she had made our own little bit of a vegetable garden with seeds her mother provided. Now my smoking and curing areas were way from the cabin, so as to not attract attention to the obvious owner and his lair. Grace did not seem to know that fall what was the right time to plant corn, so I dug them all up one evening and hid them away before they might germinate. Fall wasn't going to get us anywhere in these parts. She was disappointed that only one plant came up, but she and I would address the art of farming in the spring. I needed to hunt and fish hard, so we had a good larder of dried fish and some fresh fish on those colder days when the river didn't freeze. It would snow some in these high parts, though it would relent much of the time. I should be able to trap most weeks a month, and for the improvement of our security, there was plenty of wood. We'd be warm. We'd find a way to be warm. The first 2 times did not impress me much, but it seemed my Grace Ann was prone to take our solitude to her advantage, and unlike most girls, was not too quick to replace her garments after a wash in the lake. With time, I found her more often running like a magical white naked nymph through the spruce wood, and frolicking like a very young girl she seemed to be. This pleased the eye of any man, but I also knew it would be a temptation, far too much for any other man or boy that would enter these woods. I would surely lose her on such an event. In the order of this propensity, I had to make a rule that she fully dress when in a certain line on the hill or when outside the cloaking woods. She did, and I got used to her bare form in the daily sun, and no doubt it increased the fervor and frequency of our couplings, many of which occurred on a soft bed of wild moss in the woods. If I saw her carrying a large fur, I considered it an invitation for a woodsy frolic of the most pleasant nature. So it happened one overcast day that one trapper that I knew too well came by our blissful mountain and trapping grounds. Darby Crump was a man damaged in body and mind, and I think never had a soul that could have been ruined either. He wore ragtaggle furs each stitched together badly and looked for all the world like a mangy wolf with red suspenders walking on 2 feet. Where his rumpled mismatched fur ended and his similarly mangy brown, silver and tan head began was hard to determine on first gaze. His infamous red suspenders had suffered a few notches, darkened with stains, and was missing a column or 3 of thread on the right side, made almost dark maroon for the lack of any washing in all these years. While on my ladder adjusting some pelts up in the boughs, I saw him before he saw me. But even with a dangerous leap down from this lofty position, I still gave him 2 full seconds advantage, assuming, of course, I could not get a hold of my pistol on the drop. I was anyway a sitting fool up there, if he could see well and remember enough. As I recall, me and the Deckers ran off with 3 loaded mules one fall, and the lad boxed his ears right heavy for complaining. We did pay him on leaving, if that's what I remember all right, maybe a full 10 cents. He was likely mad at me, so I expected the worst. Darby was raising his gun slowly and then suddenly seemed distracted. How well I needed a stray bear or wolf at this moment, but it was a bear thing of another kind, and no less my beloved, not in a stitch or winking his way. She beckoned him with a finger, and he grinned. I was soon on the ground, and as Trapper Lee had taught me, popped him good in the knee. One did not always wish to kill a man outright if you have time and a steady approach to merely taking away their mobility. I like to cripple first and ask questions later. I've stayed friends with a couple fellers on account of this benign practice, but unlike my other friends, he did not take kindly to swindle, and my evil side took over. I slit his age-old red suspenders with a sweep of my knife that carefully opened up his flannel shirt a bit. My Kentucky long poked several times and quite hard at his noggin. He was now more infuriated than a wounded catamount with you carrying away her kittens. Darby Crump, what do you want coming up here and gawking at my wife in her bathing state? I continued to explain the nature of her bare state, which still persisted. I should make a coat of the mangy hat of ye, I persisted with a little bit of theater. No offense meant. I was following a goodly badger, he said with utmost insincerity, holding his knee, cringing, clearly in pain and submissive. Now that would be my badger, as every beast for 10 miles around here, I protested with growing real anger. I missed him, but I papered my mistake, he said, the pain growing more. I could see it in his eyes. Some had hid pain. This level of pain could not be hidden. I shall leave you out here for the badgers and coyotes and wolves, if not something bigger, I said, my anger now moderated in midland. I've got goods on my horse. Take 'em if you want, and some furs too. I'll make you a deal. I took your furs, and even the Lampleys, a poor name for starving Injuns. They'll whip your ass with 'em. I have a gun, an old trusty kind they don't make today, with some silver, he continued, more desperate, clutching himself, revealing some secrets. I sent Gracie Ann down the hill, and she verified some silver rocks, an old gun, and a good number of supplies, some spoiled and rank. I'll let you off for the silver alone, I said, feeling generous. And he did what a fool always does. And I shall keep the sight of your lovely in my head forever, for days, he admitted, grinning with yellow and brown teeth, and mimicked 4 tugs at his manhood. Oh, I should have killed him outright for the offense, nay, several offenses, for my dear wife had yet been spared the brutal, bloody mess of my nature in times past in other places. She didn't know of me. So I tied him to his horse and rode alongside him until we reached a particular part of the land, a half day off. No, not here. Not, I pray you. I've stashed furs up the country some. Worth a mere fortune, he begged. There's Injuns up here. I cut him loose and galloped off. I did not listen much, but came back. I decided to tie him up to a recently erected burial stand in very sacred Apache country. I knew my way out of the hill and down by a backside, and so the next thing happened. I built a fire so the scenario would drag out all night. It was a roaring thing, visible for miles. I put a leg bone in his hand, well tied up. It was some deer jerky, for which all the world looked like the departed one's remaining flesh. I got my head start running down the hill, found my horse where the Apache would not go, fired off 3 shots to get even more attention. I walked backwards towards my valley. As the sun set, I heard a blood-curdling scream of the kind not heard in years. I knew his fate, and technically it was off my seared conscience, mostly. My record with women folk was not good. Not that I didn't do what was to be done, but I didn't seem to be their liking. Nor was there any record for reform in me. I returned from my newest trail one day, a journey of 1.5 days to find no Gracie Ann there. There was no sign of anything bad or good. Her things were all in the house. What I feared must have happened. Her displays were shown to the wrong man, and surely she was taken. I waited there for 2 months, and soon grief came upon me. I humped the bed with eyes closed in memory of our bliss, spilling my seed on the fur. I left the next day with all my goods and pelts. Josiah Miller, Away West, read by the author Larry Hatch. The Big Thump. For the first time in my traveling and trapping life, I did not want a cave nor a cabin, but to be open in the wood, to be truly in it, and not just upon it or under it. I made a large pyramidal shelter formed by stout beams, much as a cabin, but supported by verticals in the center, something like a stronger teepee of the Cherokee. Instead of deerskin, my conical walls were made of the greenest spruce bough, tied together with native vines. Upon it I stretched boughs of finer and finer texture to keep the rain out. As Trapper Lee had shown me, you layer bold shoots on the outer bit, finer ones in the middle, and then a layer of moss or buckskin or fur, if you can find it, on the inner bit. This all took time, and one had to work up to all 4 or 5 layers over weeks, not needing it all right away. Besides, it had to dry. Then I piled dark debris upon it to look like a dirt hill. Trapper Lee in my head reminded me that a dark shelter attracted less notice and was not easily seen in the dark, even up close. Blend in as much as you can, and when it can't be ready to fire on all hours of the day, he said in what seemed like dreams of him from the past. He was very much alive in my mind, and along the way, he did not rightly talk to me, but in quotations of his wisdom I had no shortage of these faithfully spoken with his own voice. I even planted trees in specific spots to make my shelter be really a mound of dirt and leaves. It had the aspect of a natural berm, especially when the weeds begin to seed into its slopes. Inside it was a palace of handmade wooden chairs. These, the bed and floor lined in furs, were just a palace. I used furs I didn't want to sell under my name, but these were rug-grade furs, and that was not a concept I invented, but by now it was possible for me to sell trade premium in rug-grade furs. Rug-grade furs were the lowest in the 4 categories. I set them up as rug-grade, trade premium, and big city coats, which had to be perfect in every way. The trapping year was upon us, and I was alone in my endeavors now, despite all the mountain fellers in these parts, and also having a wife or two. In any case, Gracie Ann and Lucia were not in my company, if they still existed at all. They were not missed in physical terms, for the local Apache tribe had learned pale-face ways, and a certain brave named Big Thunder was something of a madam for the collection of squaws he collected by hook or crook. Some were half-breeds, neither suitable for hitching up to his guys. Some were gals, were pretty, but one had better arrive early in the day and pay more to be sure. He pay more. Got a pretty girl ripped from my tent. And I saw the gleam of a U.S. Army officer waiting in the background, for he had another girl. I was quickly furnished with a creature that was only female in theory and of the barest anatomical definitions. The officer paid more and won. Among white fellas, Big Thunder was known as the Big Thump, for he was heard in his private tents in the woods. I ran into more than a few U.S. cavalry officers in his woodland village of ice. I have no idea how they got that far west, but his women were well known for creative acts of pleasurable kinds, and my experience they would engage in any fantasy you might design. Why a lofty army colonel would wish to be abused and ordered around by a simple Indian squaw was beyond me. But being a businessman, I admired another one with a scheme that worked and paid well. Lucia or not. My solitary, lonely, and reclusive nature came to a fore, for it was surely a choice by now. Yet I was ailing in my back and left leg from a recent fall down a slope and needed some help. No use paying a doctor, as I'd heal in time and merely required a temporary assistant. I ventured to the nearest town to find an apprentice, a term being an ambitious, young, energetic young man who's happy to work for a third of what a grown man deserves, and perhaps nothing at all. I found a lad named Polly Walker to be eager to learn, ready for anything that gave room and board, and with no real connections to town folks. Might have easily tortured and killed and tossed his body in the woods for anybody in the town cared. Such it was with many minds that hired young lads with no connections, and thousands of them were lost in the greed of the West, not the least number being Negro or Chinese. Polly Walker was a decent fellow, and I taught him more than 40 of Trapper Lee's best tips in the time we spent together, bringing furs from the curing rack to market. I later heard he became mayor of the town Liberty Falls, till the Apache took over the town and killed nearly all of them. That made me a bit sad. Trappers cannot always bring their skins to market, and sometimes just hoard them until the prices go up. That's if you're not starving. One spring the black beaver might be in demand back east, while the next it might be a colored buckskin or fox or silver wolf. Silver wolf had a niche market that dried up now and again. I sometimes stockpiled unpopular furs for a year until the price was worth it. Time in your market is most important for your fortune, said Trapper Lee, and in those days I had no concept of not selling a thing right away or for instant gratification. Golden cash on the barrel right away, soon as possible. But Trapper Lee was by far the wisest man I'd met, and in his sayings he'd made me fatter and wiser and richer too. As I rounded Mortimer's Falls, I saw something in the brush and almost fired at it. From just my particular angle, camping 20 feet off the trail, I saw a bundle of furs. I approached and found another, and then more than 32 in all. Holy moose racks! A single feller might live 2 or 3 years on the wealth from this quality lot alone. There's hardly a bad fur among them. I was shocked and overjoyed, and yet dared not shout a word, as the hills were full of other trappers and Indians. How could it be that any wise trapper wouldn't hide them deeper and better? The land had showed signs of a recent storm, and many trees were blown down. I assumed this cache had been driven from its deeper hiding into my life. It is the better prepared that are lucky, said you-know-who. I divided my found furs, this treasure trove, into 3 caches, and these I put truly far from the trail and much better hid. When I arrived back in Bessemer Bend trading post, Wolf was shocked at all I brought and wondered how I'd been so productive in such little time. Seems like the angels dropped finished furs on you, lad, he said with surprise at the quantity and quality both. I could feel the daggers of old men in the room with only half as many pelts, and not one of theirs equal to my worst ones. They whispered about, and I heard them wanting to track me to find this heavenly trapping place. I knew my throat was as good as cut deep already if I should tell the I found them story and not disclose my hidden valley of wild existence. So I formed a false story in case of being kidnapped. They went there, and I went the opposite way. I miss my Lucia greatly now and traveled down to Tucson to spend some time with her. I did not need to work for a spell, the recent fine being very fine in terms of money and bullion paid. I arrived in the evening at Lucia's hotel, and being still a sensible hour, I asked the clerk to summon my wife. He looked at me blankly and said her room had been vacant for some time. She had not written to me in weeks, so I was more than a little concerned. I knew she had a thing for a particular elite hotel up in Phoenix way, a place called Tempe, or Temp, I'm not sure which it is. Tempe, I think. I walked down a piece, and she was there, my glowing, glorious Lucia, in the ballroom of the hotel. She might as well have been a fancy saloon girl. The job was essentially the same, but these things are always hidden, disguised, finessed, made subtle, in a matter of degrees. So was the shame, social standing, and the guilt. Subtle, in degrees. In those days, a classy saloon girl was free to take a beau for a night, a week, or a month, even an hour, depending on his bank book or her employer's requirements. She would usually be forced by her fiancé, a French word for sin, I guess. And if he was not much older, her long-lost uncle. In my graying beard, I'd been shacked up with my daughter from back east more than a time or two. If the beau paid for a week, she was at least several positions above the common whore, though her conscience might not remain much different. The church ladies, pious and without sin as they were surely not, considered the whore and saloon girl the same character, only differentiated by the price of her perfume, dress, and hat. If her corset was of European whalebone and not Virginian steer, well, that was a difference known. Curiously, I knew the difference. The saloon gal usually had to say things, but sweet about on the slacker side of morality when the money was stacked tall and wide, high enough. Thus the boundary between whore, faux relative, escort, and girlfriend for the week, and gentleman's companion were as slippery a commodity as possible. I had to hold myself back from punching the rascal James Tolliver for what he had made of my wife in this hotel. No doubt he had dipped toe in the pond a time or 20, and I did not care to know the number. It was well known he owned a hotel and ran girls and gambling. She spotted me in the fanciest suit I'd ever worn, my hair cut short, a thin mustache instead of a trapper's unruly beard, and yet my same silver and pearl guns a shinin', proud and with some menace. "You left me with no money," she said with her terribly dark, angry eyes, slightly masking the curiosity of seeing me in some civilized form. "I sent plenty of money," I retorted. It sounded too angry, actually. "Well, the new hotel owner doubled my rates, and the bank froze my money when you were wanted." "I never knew, Lucia. Was I wanted, and for what?" Well, I knew, but I denied it. "You were wanted often and for everything. How could you? You were gone." "And what of Tolliver? Is he just your boss or more?" "I am married to just one man, and more the worse for it." She stammered and stuttered, began sobbing again. Until this second, her strength as a grown woman with steady form had impressed me. She had grown from a girl I loved and adored to a right fine, mature woman of immense beauty and a character its equal. She just had that graceful way that only some women have. Her eyes were more compelling than ever, for never before had she been truly angry with me. Angry women, yes, indeed, are prettier, though less approachable. Such may be said of the wolf and the bear. Lucia agreed to come with me, even if we indeed formed a proper marriage for once. I was permitted to travel for the fur business, and indeed it would be hard to be a trapper with a wife nearby anywhere that she wanted to live. I would always be somewhere I could be found, and so was my pledge. To the latter end, we hired a houseboy ranch hand for the house that she wanted, and he would be able to track me down anywhere about the state or territories. I left all my maps and details and estimated timetable with him. It did very little good, for my wanderings could ever hardly be planned. That day, I was trapping in the surrounding area and had not been gone 2 days, and the house was empty of humans. No Lucia, no houseboy, no barn boy. The stove looked like it had not been cooked upon in days. No antiques or treasures were gone, but I hardly remembered all that. I spent the next 2 days riding around, following tracks the best I could after the recent dust storm, and not one creature could be found. I checked the house. Her clothes seemed to be there. There were no notes. There was no sign of robbery or conflict. Her favorite ring was still there. She'd have taken that. I waited 2 more days, hoping that the 3 of them were just gone to visit friends. But it was not long before I decided to spend some of the newly found fur fortune on the Pinkertons. No one could find people like them lads. They were consummate professionals, logical to a fault, and always impeccably dressed, well-spoken. And many were former army men with discipline and a set of very grand skills that took them well above others in those days. They wired all around to their many offices, and in 3 days had narrowed the story to 2 likely events. One was that she was killed in a stagecoach wreck from Tucson to Liberty. The coach had been hurled into a deep ravine, and the bodies could not be recovered. Well, I know what that means. The other was that she'd run off with a fancy-dressed man, likely a traveling poker player, whose name was somewhat in dispute. Well, neither of these scenarios was welcome, but surely one above the other was true. I put my funds for them on hold until I could evaluate the choices myself. I did not really have enough money for a dozen of their men to investigate both paths, so I had to decide. I rode from Tucson to Liberty to the ravine. I just had to know. The ravine was indeed a deep one, and I needed more than 3 full ropes in a day to get down to where the painted wood bits could be seen, splintered and broken, fractured. The carcasses of the horses were bleaching in the sun. I was prepared in my heart and head to see the worst. I dug through what remained of the coach, and there was not a hint of any human skeletons or clothes or even luggage. I searched every crevice, and there was not a way for a beast to still a body. The type of thick embroidered crest she traveled with would not dissolve or fade away, neither would her coat, nor would a coachman's leather bag or locked box. The wagon clearly went over with no people or valuable things aboard. So I ruled out a stage crash. I ruled it out as a stage crash for a reason yet to be determined. Clearly there was something up, something very wrong. Had they been robbed and taken away? More likely had the stage been driven over the edge? The riders and luggage taken elsewhere as hostages? Once in town, I visited the express office and told what I had seen. I asked the sheriff. There had been a coach gone missing from Tucson to Liberty about a month back. Yeah, seen it down the ravine. No hope for them poor souls. I told him of my climbing findings at the crash site. He too was shocked. He was sure bodies were down there. Story was, if I recall, that a rich businessman was on board, and he had them fancy certificates on him. We never did get his name, and inquiries were made back eastwise. I assumed such a man had staged his death for the locals, if not his men back east. The fancy rich man had been seen in a particular town. Merlin's Crossing was now one of those highfalutin towns, if you divided towns into 2 categories. One being nasty, classless mud holes smelling of shit and ugly diseased whores. It was not that folks in Merlin's Crossing were proper, clean religious type, but they were mostly free of rough cowboys and people like me. It was in essence a town run by ladies and their captive husbands, to whom Sheriff Portillo owed a recent election, and whose ear was always turned to the way of the ladies that ran the town. One of these prominent ladies was in fact Mrs. Portillo, to whom he must daily answer in the voting. As I had no idea of the name of the fancy gambler with whom my beloved might have departed, my inquiries had to be slow and clever. It became obvious that type of slick card shark was not welcomed in this town, and could have stayed long. Still, one better not tip your hand too suddenly, especially as a stranger with a rough look. Depressed and two at the end of my leads, I retreated to my familiar cave. My grief was submerged in my soul, but I was beginning to be certain that Lucia must be dead or happily gone away. I channeled so many different feelings and thoughts into my trapping work, catching more pelts in 1 week than ever before. I turned my frustration and anger into a fortnight of treasure. Now Archie Decker owed me a favor. He'd loaned me a man or two. To search for my wife. The Decker bunch was not more than a gang of brothers or families like the Prill, but a group of specialists of one type, and very good at these narrow focuses. While they mainly hit trains, they did have a safe cracker, because train in those days might have a safe that needs opening in a minute or less. We had explosive experts, a couple of ladies for distractions, and general acting up on the scene. Young lads were spry around the corners of a crowded train package room, and assorted gunfighters from riflemen to pistoleros. Trains also had false documents and fake gold, so we needed to tell the diversion boxes from the real treasure, fat fake gems from real. They had men for that too. I had been in several of these roles, and Archie reminded me of our exciting adventure in Thin Escapes. They needed fellers to run the train in a pinch if the driver and engineer needed to be shot and all, or just tossed off to die. Heck, they even had a fake sheriff with a badge to tell citizens things were under control and to fire blanks, driving the real concerned men back. Archie was laying shot up in bed, so I could not ask him a favor right away. I pressed him later and was turned away by his cousin. I was not happy for the rebuff, but when I happened upon some fellows trying to form a gang and do well with trains, I spilled Deckard's secrets discussed above. I went on. They wanted to be called something, and in a short vote we decided on Dan's Bunch, named for a pal of theirs who had died in the last failed bank robbery. They vowed that would never happen again. I went on about the Deckers. They mainly pick a train suspected of carrying massive cases of gold, more than suspected if possible. Now, the railroad company sent out fake plans for their gold shipments, so the dispatchers and planners of the routes usually know what shipment's real and what's not. You need a man to be a loader, or on the security team, or you're wasting your time. You might die for nothing. "What else can we do?" said one eager fellow, drinking up my experience like a man who'd been a week in the desert. "Have a front fireman to get the engineer, and then if one of yours trained to take over perfectly, must be able to run an engine like a pro." The men nodded, not having thought of this detail. "Then there are boarders, usually 3 men on each side of the train on horses. They must be skilled at firing on the go at high speeds. Then there's a tail boarder who enters the caboose side with 2 big guns and a repeater among them." "Go on. Take notes, Jonas. This is good. The boarders and the front firemen take control. Then you bring in the other specialists. By the way, each man has a backup in case he's shot, so you might need 15, 20 men in all." 20? We're going with 6. "Don't. Sure is failure, that number. I didn't say you had to split it 20 ways. Just have to take 20. They nodded. "Now the storage car will be heavily secured with a metal door and locks and the like, plus heavily armed guards. Wasn't so once, but today expect skilled gunmen around any treasure. In fact, if you see them, there's probably treasure. Now you need a blower to put dynamite on the door and 2 sharps behind him with lots of firepower to charge in when the smoke clears. The sharps must be fearless. These 3 then throw the boxes clear to the side of the road. You don't check things there no matter how much you're tempted. Do that later." Wow, this is magic. Words of gold, them. Now there's more. You need haulers who take wagons and mules along the route, because you cannot always pick the stopping point. Sometimes they run a mile or more after your attack. Now the haulers take the heavy bits out. If you can determine they're light gold boxes, then the fleet haulers run off fast with racing horses. Your best horses must be with your fleet haulers. The main haulers arrive later with the heavy loads and wagons, and that might include a metal safe. You crack that later." I was very firm, and they took notes and seemed to agree.